So here are the scriptures for Palm Sunday. The first is, I hope, a well-known one verse from the prophet Micah in the Hebrew Bible, chapter 6, verse 8. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does God require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And then from the prophet Zechariah, which is kind of the classic Palm Sunday Old Testament or Hebrew Bible text, because this was the one that Jesus knew well and understood himself to be fulfilling when he rode that donkey into Jerusalem. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. By the way, this is Zechariah 9, verses 9 and 10. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. And he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river, to the ends of the earth. And then the Palm Sunday story from Mark 11. Starting in verse 11, when Jesus and the disciples were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you'll find there a colt tied that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. And if anyone asks you, why are you doing this? Just say, the Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here immediately." They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. And as they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to him, "What are you doing, untying the colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. And then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." And then Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. There ends the reading. All right, now there's really only one Palm Sunday joke that comes up, so you kind of get stuck with it year after year. But since there's always a few new people who haven't heard it, it's only once a year. So a young girl, I at least changed the gender this time to a young girl instead of a boy. Right? A young girl and her family were very regular Sunday morning worship attenders, and they were there just about every Sunday. But this one Sunday, this little girl got sick, and she couldn't come, so she and her dad stayed home. Mom and the rest of the kids came to church, and it was Palm Sunday. And the kids came home from church with palms that they had gotten in church on Sunday, and they were waving the palms, and the little girl said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, it's Palm Sunday." And she said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, "Well, it's the day that Jesus comes, and everybody waves palms." And she goes, "Oh, great, the one Sunday I miss, and Jesus shows up." I'll find a new one for next year. Or else I'll just spare you. All right. Well, I hope and believe that Jesus, or more specifically, the risen post-Easter Christ Jesus, is with us every Sunday. With us all the time, always. But today is Palm Sunday. And as those of you who've been here in recent years may remember, I think Palm Sunday is a kind of complicated holiday, and that its deeper meanings have often been missed by the church. More times than not, it kind of comes across as a Go Jesus pep rally, leading up to the events of Holy Week. And we celebrate the victorious King Jesus, and kind of just, it feels good that Jesus finally got his props. He got some praise, and so we wave palms and, way to go, King Jesus. And we tend to miss the irony and the tragedy, in a sense, that this is setting up. Historically, it's often referred to as the triumphal entry of the Messiah, the King of David. But he wasn't about to triumph in any traditional sense. He was entering a showdown that he was deliberately provoking by coming into the packed city in fulfillment deliberately of this prophecy from Zechariah. And as we've noted often, Jesus' people were convinced that the Messiah, their leader, was going to be a military figure who would overthrow their enemies, in this case, the Romans. That's what they were waiting for. I made that point many, many times. In the past years, I've shared that I think we should rename Palm Sunday and instead call it Provocation Sunday, in order to underscore that Jesus knew he was provoking a conflict. A conflict with his own religious leaders, and that was nothing new. He'd been in conflict with them pretty much his whole ministry. They were the only ones he consistently had trouble with. Bible-quoting people who got too wrapped up in the rules and forgot the love. Those were the only people Jesus constantly had problems with. But it was also the Romans, the secular authorities, the political authorities, who saw Jesus or any charismatic figure who could gather a crowd that would listen to him in this context. They always had their eye on somebody who could gather a crowd, because they were expecting the Jews to rise up against them and try to militarily revolt and overthrow them. So the Jews did not like this charismatic figure who refused to bow down to Caesar and who had more and more people following him and adulating him all the time. All through his ministry, when Jesus would do a miracle, almost always he would say to the person who just got miraculously healed or something, okay, now go, but don't tell anybody about this. And when people were trying to get him to sort of like come out, and do his thing publicly, he kept on saying, my hour has not yet come. It's not time. He was really sensitive to timing. Palm Sunday marks the time when Jesus says, okay, guys, it's time. It's time to go public with this. The word Hosanna, it's kind of a weird word we don't hear much. That was code language in Jesus' context. It was only used to refer to the Messiah in the line of David. King David was a military figure. He was the second king, Saul. King Saul was the first king of Israel. And when David came around, the slogan was, Saul has killed thousands in battle, but David 10,000s. That's why they loved him. He was good at beating the enemy in battle. So for them to say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of David, Hosanna, they were saying, our military man has come. Jesus knew that if the Romans heard that, or his own Jewish leaders heard that, there was going to be trouble. And there was. He knew it all along. Well, this year, it's just amazing when you think about it. I mean, what Jesus kept on saying to them was, there's not going to be a military resolution to our problem here. It's not going to happen that way, you guys. That was his consistent message. It's stunning how the world has refused to hear that message. How the church has historically refused to hear that message, thinking, no, there's got to be some form of might that can solve the problems. So, this year, what I want to focus on, though, is the donkey. Quite simply, the donkey was and is a symbol of humility. Humility. My goodness. As I reflected this past week on what it means to embrace and embody humility, I was really moved by how powerful and beautiful and essential humility is. And how elusive it is. I mean, someone who claims to be humble probably isn't, right? But Jesus was. And so once again, we look to him to teach us what this deep aspect of being truly human is all about. Micah 6:8 is a wonderful verse to know by heart. I invite you to learn that one. It's an easy one. What does God require? Do justice, love kindness. But this third one, walk humbly with your God. I hear a lot about justice, and I hear a good deal about kindness, but not a lot about humility. Walking humbly with God. So I want to say just a couple things about humility this Palm Sunday. First, Jesus was able to risk entering the city on a donkey that day, knowing full well that it would offend the leaders of his own people and the Roman Empire, because he trusted God. Walking humbly with God means, as the third step in the 12-step world puts it, surrendering one's will to the care of God. Not just obeying God or doing what God tells you to do, but trusting your life to God's care. So here's a deep question. And be honest with yourself. Do you trust that God will care for you? I mean, really. In so many ways, this may be the most important question any of us can ever work with. Because otherwise you're going to just think you got to pull it off on your own, or you're going to take matters into your own hands, or you're going to come up with some concocted scheme to think you're doing the right thing when it may not be. Do you believe that no matter what happens, God has got you? Do you believe that you can trust God enough to keep moving forward and often to take some risks for the right reasons, even when you don't know what the outcome is going to be? Or when you do know that the risk you're taking will involve dealing with some things that are likely going to be costly and difficult or painful. That's, among other things, what Jesus did on Palm Sunday. He knew he was about to head into a world of hurt. But he knew he was somehow meant to. And so humility meant, I'm going to trust God with this. Second, when you know you can trust God, another way of putting that is you know that God's love is the final word on everything. When you know that, then you don't have to have the last word. I'll say that again. When you know that God's love is the final word, you don't have to have the last word. And that's what humility makes possible. The freedom to not have the last word because you know that God will. Whatever that means. And you know, because you trust God, that God's last word on anything and everything will always be about love for everyone. So another way of saying this is that the worst thing you can imagine happening is never the final thing. Let me say that again. The worst thing you can imagine happening is never the final thing. So Jesus was free to ride that donkey into Jerusalem, knowing full well that it was going to jump-start a series of events that he himself would not be able to control. And Palm Sunday shows us Jesus humble enough to trust God with that. Third, when you're humble, you know who you are. And you know who you're not. Jesus knew who he was. At this point, he knew. He was the one sent to fulfill this prophecy. He was the one. He knew it. And he knew where that was going to lead. Humility is not about playing it small. It's not being less than who you truly are. That's false humility. It's not forcing your own agenda or will on an inflated side of things either. That's an egoic agenda, conceit, arrogance. Humility is being right-sized, who you actually are. When you know who you are, you don't have to prove it to anyone. When you know who you are, you can risk being gentle, even if it's possible that someone might mistake your gentleness for weakness. Jesus was free to ride a donkey rather than a war horse into a city completely under siege by war horses. The freedom to be gentle, to not fight, to engage, but not with a might against might, or fire against fire, or hate against hate, but to be open enough to engage, but to try to do so in a different way. So, I'm almost done. On Palm Sunday, we see Jesus provoking a confrontation that would put an end to the old way of resolving conflicts. The old way was win-lose. The strong dominate the weak. The authoritarian enforces his or her, usually his, will upon others. And you say, well, that's not the old way. That's the way everything still is. Yeah. But primarily because we haven't been willing to try Jesus' way on a wide enough scale. All right. In closing, as I was thinking about all this last week, it occurred to me that one of the things about spirit-centered humility that's so beautiful is that it grows us into people who prefer conversation rather than confrontation. There are times when a confrontation is necessary or even healthy, and Jesus shows us that also. But more times than not, what God really wants is a conversation. And when we're humble, we can risk admitting that we're not always right. We can risk admitting that someone else is right, or that we're both partially right and partially wrong. Humility creates the safety in which conversation and honesty can happen. I'm not going to get directly into the Gaza thing today, but in Luke's version of Palm Sunday, before Jesus rides into the city, he goes up on the mountain of Mount Olives, and he looks over the city, and it says that he started to cry. And he said, "You don't know the things that make for peace." And then there's this quote where he says, "Because you won't make things for peace," this isn't the quote, "because you don't know the things that make for peace, you're going to have tremendous conflict, and they will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave you within you one stone upon another." It just all feels so relevant. That's what happens when people are not humble enough to have conversations rather than confrontations. So how does this get real in our own lives? Being humble and not needing to be right opens up so much beautiful, powerful stuff. And I'm going to just close with this. As I was looking back on my parenting of my children at one point, I realized that I had never modeled for my kids a healthy way of being angry. I thought anger was somehow bad. And that was just because I had not really ever dealt with it myself, because I grew up in a family where there was too much confrontation and too much anger, and there wasn't room in the house for another person's anger. So I became the peacemaker. Some of you have played that role. And I didn't really learn how to be angry without causing a problem. And by the way, the first thing Jesus does after Palm Sunday is he goes into the temple and turns over the tables. So that happens on Tuesday. So I called up my kids, each one, a few years ago. And I said, I've been thinking about something. I think there's one area where I didn't parent you very well. I never really showed you what it looks like to get angry in a healthy way. I just didn't get angry. And I said, I'm sorry about that. Anger is actually an important, healthy thing. And we had a great conversation about that. But I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't able, in the spirit of God's love, to admit to my kids that I was wrong about something, that I didn't do something well. So here's my closing question. Where in your life do you need to be humble? To trust God? To have the final word? Let go of your own need to? To be secure enough in who you are, knowing who you are, that you can risk admitting when and where you've been wrong, or maybe partially right, and to have a conversation instead of a confrontation. Could change your world. It would change our world. All right, that's enough.